What happens when you force zero RB drafters to draft a robust running back roster? And I guess what in general are we talking about when we go through some of these strategies and how you can potentially make that work? Because Tom, we want to win these contests. We want to try and have opportunities. So we don't we don't want to just blow our money and burn our money to kick off these drafts. Like we'll have some fun drafts and we'll probably do things that people immediately think, well, they have just wasted their money there. But we're trying to do it in ways that give you access to interesting builds that give you opportunities to potentially win these type of contests. Today we will be drafting in the DraftKings Milly Maker. We'll be seeing if that roster then how it will look at the end, how comfortable we'll be. We are going to try and force ourselves to go down the, I'll say, hyper fragile. I'm not going 4 running backs here in the first 4 rounds, I don't think, but I think we could be going 3 in the first 5, and we'll talk through, depending on draft slot and everything like that, how the draft plays out. But that is our goal here, and I don't know. We may feel ill during this, Tom, but we're going to have a lot of fun, I think, doing it, trying it. So for anyone who is watching in, do let us know who the running backs you would be drafting in those first 5 rounds, your priority options if you were doing a build like this would be. Then we'll see how our draft plays out, and maybe we'll get cold feet and change our mind instantly. But this is an edition of the RotoViz Best Ball Show. Each week we have been doing one of these on the RotoViz YouTube channel 1 week. The following week it's been at the Fantasy Sanctuary, and we've been flipping back and forth between myself and my co-host here, Tom Strachan. So Tom, how are you doing today as we get ready to kick off today's show?
Yeah, doing good. I mean, when you suggested this as a show topic and a way to approach a draft, I had a good chuckle to myself because it's the last thing normally. And normally if we're in a draft and I go, let's take this running back here, or such and such running back is falling 12 spots past ADP, normally there's a moment's silence before you go, let's just take Trey McBride instead. So to find ourselves in a different situation, I'm definitely for it. I think it could be good fun, and yeah, hopefully it gives everybody watching or listening some food for thought.
Yeah, well, I didn't say we wouldn't be drafting Trey McBride. At no point did we agree on that, but we'll see what happens with the draft, all joking aside. But we are going to set that up in a moment. But if we're looking at how things are set up and how ADP looks and, how you could potentially do this, I feel like there is an opportunity this year to get some, because there's obviously less running backs going in those opening rounds. There's a much more wide receiver heavy approach. There may be parts of the content that we produce or discuss that may lead to that having become more of an approach over the last couple of years. But you have, we're in DraftKings here where it's PPR, which obviously gives an element of boost to the wide receivers. But there's some of the running backs going in those opening 3 rounds who have the potential to be, a 3-down running back and get all the work in the PPR game as well, which would give them an extraordinary ceiling in this particular format. So there is ways to filter that in. It's usually that decision then based on the cost of the wide receivers, tight ends, even quarterbacks available in those ranges versus the running back production. And can you replicate that potentially at a later point off the draft? But kicking it off, Tom, one of the things that I would emphasize to people if you are thinking about going with this approach, and it was I wouldn't say the common process, but people were afraid that if you didn't get running backs through those opening 3, 4, 5 rounds, that when your running back would potentially then get injured, you wouldn't be able to replicate that production. And I think that with the research and the information that's been in the fantasy sphere over the last couple of years, that is becoming less commonplace, but it is still there. If somebody went with that approach 2 or 3 years ago, now they might be comfortable getting 2 wide receivers in 4 rounds to pair with 2 running backs. It mightn't be as extreme as what we may be looking to do in some of our drafts, but that does set you up for the chance to do it. The one thing that I was going to mention there, though, is in the approach, if I do a draft like this, it would be 3 in those first 5 rounds, but you could start being into then a 4 running back build, probably 5, but how we'd normally be looking at 6 or 7. We're not, if we're taking them early, the advantage isn't there to be taking them late. And that's the challenging part, is then balancing out the roster with the wide receivers that you're taking in those later spots. You are going to need some extra options like that to balance out the overall roster. So is there anything when we're thinking about this, getting ready to jump into it, that you're looking ahead thinking, how are we going to balance this out?
So the one thing when I've looked into Robust RB over the last couple of years that stands out is when you look at it on the RotoViz Underdog Advance Rate Explorer, if you throw an elite tight end into the build, inside the first 5 rounds, it
Sounds like
really
Trey
does.
McBride to me.
It really does make it much more viable. So last year, if you selected your RB3 before round 5 with a tight end 1 before round 5, it advanced at a rate of 17.1% on underdog if you stopped at 5 running backs. There was only 1,700 teams that did that. And obviously, you're talking about a very small amount of tight ends. You're basically looking for which tight end succeeded. But last year, not many of the tight ends in the very early rounds succeeded
Agree.
particularly well. But
Yep.
if you go back to 2022, do the same process of take your RB3 before round 5, your tight end 1 before round 3. That year, it absolutely smashed because the early round tight ends were good. You know, there was teams that only had 4 running backs with a 20% advance rate, 5 running backs, 20.7%. Even taking 6 running backs was right about average. So I think that's the way to kind of supercharge it, and it's something which Pat Crane, Madison Parkhill have both talked about, that if you add the tight ends, the elite tight ends, and they really hit at the right time of year, it can supercharge just about any roster construction. So if a chance presents itself that we can go 3 running backs, a wide receiver, and a tight end, or 3 running backs, tight end through the first 4 rounds, then maybe that's the way to go with this.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think the part that a lot of people are starting to realize, there was obviously a lot of discord over the last kind of 14 days or so on Twitter around elite tight ends and what are elite tight ends. But when you have that, it gives you such an advantage on a weekly basis at the position, and the high scoring ceiling that those guys offer then on a season long basis is just giving those rosters, even when maybe they're not set up for ultimate success, those win rates and advance rates that you've mentioned there are strong. So we will be trying it. We'll see how it goes. The last question before we get into it is, obviously, again, the key is going to be to hold that off once you get to that kind of floodgate of 3, and not, then not bite if it's a case that, oh, here's another option, or here's a falling running back, trying to stick to that structure. Who are some of the targets? So looking through the first 3 rounds, we have Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, Gibbs, Taylor, Barkley, Henry, Achane, Williams, Etienne, Pacheco. You get Jacobs and Joe Mixon in the 4th round, Rashad White, James Cook, Alvin Kamara in the 6th round, or the 5th round. And there's just some names there that I'm not interested in at all. We talked on our last show, you talked about your liking Ramondre Stevenson this season. I know he's come out of your list of targets recently, but Aaron Jones is in the 6th. There's some more interesting names, Kenneth Walker in that kind of range, that I feel like, if you have 3 through 6, I think, is probably the way to do it. 2 through 3 rounds, and then have, probably your 3 through 6 or 7 is probably the best way. Is there any names there? I'm going to call out these names. So Mixon, Josh Jacobs, Rashad White, Alvin Kamara. They're probably the names I'm not as interested in. Saquon Barkley at ADP, I'm not really interested in. The rest of them, though, then I think are all in play. And the one I'm interested in your thoughts on that we haven't really talked about at all is Derrick Henry, because obviously now with the Ravens, and you're our Ravens guy, we haven't. He's a player.
What gave it away?
Yeah, we haven't touched on it at any point really this season in our drafts. But in this strategy, how are you feeling about those guys in general and those rounds that I mentioned? Anyone that's off the list for you, and then give me your thoughts on Derrick Henry.
I think the biggest thing for me in this kind of build, when we're going into it with a predetermined mindset, which obviously isn't the most, plus EV thing to do when you're approaching best ball, but I think when we're looking at this room, if we get a wide receiver heavy room and we can scoop some of the value, like if we can get players like Derrick Henry 10 spots past ADP, that's the way to really approach this. Like, I'm almost less bothered about the individual players, more just going, okay, are we constructing something that other teams aren't doing? And then once we get past those kind of 3 running backs, the teams, going back 2 years ago in the DK Milly final, which at the time was almost 1,500 person final, this was the year that Pat Crane won underdog with a dual running back start. And that was, again, a really popular roster construction on DraftKings. But there was as many robust RB teams that year as there were 0 RB teams that year. So the way that the robust teams did it was still the vast majority of them hit 5 wide receivers by the time that they got to round 10.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking to do this, I think you kind of go, okay, we're probably not going to be able to take a quarterback in the first 10 rounds. We probably still want one tight end if we can get the elite tight end into this system. But then otherwise, we kind of got to ignore the running back after those first couple and really hammer wide receiver. So by the time we get to like Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, I'm not overly interested in those guys, but we'll see what falls to us. As for Derrick Henry, yes, he's not really going to catch any balls. We know that. We know that Lamar's not going to throw of running backs at a high rate. We know that Derrick Henry doesn't earn targets at a high rate. But
my dream has always been Derrick Henry on additional screen passes. It seems like every time he catches one, it's just, he's going quite a distance there.
And Todd Monken's known for designing a screen game. Like before Todd Monken came to Baltimore, the screen game was so rare that every time a screen happened, it'd be like once every game or two. All the Baltimore beat writers would suddenly tweet about it. Oh, a rare sighting of a screen. So there's been more last year than there's been in years. But the big thing that helps Derrick Henry in this format is the 100-yard bonus. Like, he can pick up 3 points on DraftKings for getting 100 rushing yards, which kind of helps balance out against the passing game a bit. It's just tricky if you try to catch up to somebody like CMC who can get 100-yard bonus in both receiving and the rushing game. Yeah,
but obviously that's pretty much impossible for any other running back, but that is something that you have to factor in. Some interesting comments, and Deft Angel, who's been tuning into these streams over the last couple of weeks and often drafts alongside us in these contests. He said he hopes we get the 101 to make this decision easy, but he does mention that Breece Bijan and CMC, then Achan or Kyron Williams in the second, and then Pacheco would be a start that he wouldn't hit. The other one that I was interested in is James Young messages in here that he has 0 Breece Hall through 57 BBM drafts so far. I'd be interested to know, James, if that's due to draft spot, if it's somebody you're just avoiding this year. The profile of Breece Hall, even though in usually first, second rounds, I'm not jumping to want to draft running backs. The profile for him is just far too impressive and intriguing to pass up when we talk about somebody who could potentially mirror something like Christian McCaffrey's season. I feel that Hall fits into it, another year removed from the injury as well. But let's jump in. We'll get our thoughts as we go along from the people listening in the chat, and we'll get, if they have any questions on the running backs we select or the thoughts throughout the draft, I would be interested in that. Nick also mentions JT if he falls past 20, Kyron or Derrick Henry if they fall into the mid to late third round. I think they're all interesting, but today we might even be forcing it where we maybe even take them at ADP. We'll see what happens here, Tom. It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I like to do drafts that I don't normally do, and full transparency for people who have been long time listeners of RotoViz Overtime or the streams. Last year, one of the things that we did try and approach quite a bit was in those rounds, 3 through 5. That was where Ramondre Stevenson was going last year. Travis Etienne was somebody who drafting quite a bit. Number of names in there where there was a number, like quite a decent number, probably about 20% of our drafts last year that went a little bit heavier running back in those opening rounds. It wasn't as successful as we had hoped, but it still did provide some success, particularly in the season-long formats rather than some of those best ball rosters. But we'll give it another shot here and see how it works out. And we also, I'm sure people get bored, Tom, watching this draft, late quarterback, 0 RB rosters all off season with Trey McBride in the third round.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth doing because it's very easy to fall into a trap of drafting the same constantly. Hayden Winks had some good work lately talking about how 0 RB drafters tend to all align to the same players. So I did a draft last week on Underdog where when we got to the kind of the rounds where I'm normally auto-clicking Jaylen Warren, instead I made the case for Najee Harris. And from there, it just changed how our build ended up going pretty much through the rest of the draft. But at the end, we were all like, you know what? This is a nice team. I like it. I still have more faith in Jaylen Warren, but it's nice to mix things up a little bit and see how these things pan out. And even if you go, okay, well, I'm not going to do that again, it's seeing the little pivot points within the draft and going, okay, well, maybe now I know that if I do this, I can still do that and work it out from there.
Yeah, the other part as well is like, even just if you're in a general draft and you have your own targets, like if you're in the second round and everyone's gone, there is a case like I did mention in the recent draft that we did where I took push the Trey McBride pick, but that was quite a bit ahead of ADP. But you don't want to be in a situation either where every single draft you're doing, you're just thinking, well, if they're gone, I'm reaching around on this particular player, and you want to kind of balance out how you're approaching it. What I like about it is then it forces you into looking at some of the wide receivers, say in the 0 RB zone, which you're maybe not drafting, which you can look at differently, and it does give you just that other perspective on those players. One thing that has been quite nice this season is a lot of the players who are targets at the running back position or wide receiver position or tight end position. The way I've been drafting, as I've mentioned, trying to get those elite guys, it feels easier to put those pieces together, because the players are at the ADPs that make it all kind of fit as a jigsaw piece, which in other years that has been much more challenging to do. So you could end up with just, a lot of the same teams drafted over and over again. So we are waiting on one more here, Tom, before it starts. So it shouldn't be too long before we are underway. We'll see what draft spot we get. If we don't get the 101, who does the chat think should be the target? Is it Bijan Robinson? Is it Breece Hall? Who would be the next running back up for the people listening in? The player that we've talked about a bit, and I don't think we've drafted together, is Jahmyr Gibbs, who also has the competition there in the backfield from Montgomery. But again, when we're looking at profiles of people who can be heavily involved in the passing game, have electric upside in terms of their athletic profile, again, he fits perfectly in it. And we have some concerns, over the last couple of years with injuries to Jonathan Taylor and how his career has kind of not maybe hit the heights we have hoped in the last couple of seasons for various reasons. Obviously, there was the time missed last year and then injured quarterback and so on. And Zach Moss was there taking up some of that work as well. So talked about it last week with the pass catching to the running back from those Russian quarterbacks, and that would be a concern there for potentially Taylor as well. So it's going to be interesting to talk through it. Now, we do end up with the 10th pick, which could be the perfect
11th.
spot. Or sorry, the 11th pick, which could be the perfect spot to implement this approach that we've discussed today.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if either Bijan or Breece slips, I mean, I have seen a couple of drafts where Breece Hall has slipped to the 11th spot and even once at the 12th spot. Never when I'm at that position, mind, like always at the opposite end. But Jahmyr Gibbs, I've been taking him in hero RB builds, and I'm completely comfortable with that. I think it more raises the question, where are we going when we get into second and the third round? Because then you start looking at which running backs are going to come back. I think this could line up for a couple of the elite tight ends. There's definitely, we've talked about Trey McBride plenty, but Trey McBride tends to line up with Marvin Harrison around that end of the board. So there's a good chance that he would be there if we decide to do that. Otherwise, running backs, you're kind of talking about Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor in round 2, Pacheco in round 4, or maybe round 3, depending on how crazy the room goes. And then after Pacheco, it kind of dries up a bit. Maybe Travis Etienne before Pacheco. I don't mind Travis Etienne. I was doing a show with Andrew Erickson of Fantasy Pros channel yesterday, and we were looking at the expert consensus rankings, which gather over 100 different rankings from across the industry. And Travis Etienne had jumped up to 15th overall in that, which isn't necessarily something. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not necessarily something I agree with, but if that's going to be the kind of common sentiment between people who are coming into these drafts at these time of years, perhaps more so for redraft than best ball. But if Etienne's going to start climbing, then now getting him around his ADP is something that I possibly want to do a little more than I have so far, because I have very little Etienne.
Yeah, and I mentioned there a moment ago, he was somebody very high on last season, and not a lot has changed in that situation. It's actually probably more positive now than it was then. Obviously, there was a lot of rumblings last season, off season, with Tank Bigsby coming into the picture there. So he is somebody that I would still be very interested in taking, but I haven't been drafting, again, just based on the wide receivers I've been taking in that area. So yeah, I'm pretty interested to see how this plays out. Bijan went at 7. Breece went at 8. So I would really like to see Gibbs get here. That's where the trouble comes in now. If Gibbs is a player that goes off the board in these next 2 picks, I'm cold feet could have me backing out here. I'm pretty comfortable. Yeah, we get it. I was ready to back out. I was ready to just, cancel everything we talked about. But Gibbs, I think, is perfect at this particular spot, because one of the things we talked about for years with 0 RB was if you have 6 running backs going off the board in the first round. The RB7 is such a drop off from the RB1, and look, you can say the RB4 is a huge drop off from the RB1 and Christian McCaffrey. But what I mean by that is you're kind of getting the best player at the other position. Whereas now in this draft, as wide receivers heavily come off the board outside of those 4 running backs, I think it gives you an opportunity to get that profile. We are back up quick. I have a preference here for Taylor over Barkley. Is that the same for you? I think they're slightly above ETN here.
Yeah, I prefer Taylor. I think Barkley is somebody I just don't like the look of my teams. Every time I end up taking Saquon Barkley, I don't feel confident on them.
One note just to ask you there, and I know seems like every stream I do, I'm talking about bye weeks, and I've done a couple of drafts with you recently, slow drafts, and I've been talking to you about different things with bye weeks. But when you're thinking about drafting a roster here, even though it is the second round, where you might only take 5, maybe even 4, depending on how many you've taken at that point of the draft, the same bye week with those 2 opening picks could be challenging when you're looking at developing the rest of the roster. The reason I mentioned that is Saquon Barkley is also a week 5 bye that would tie up with Jahmyr Gibbs, so it just gives us a little bit more flexibility because we won't be building out this running back room anywhere near where we would normally do.
Yeah, that's it. Like if you're drafting wide receivers and you're going to have a wide receiver room that's 7, 8 deep, it's much easier to say, okay, well, 2, 3 wide receivers out of my first 4 rounds on the same bye week. That's fine. We'll build around it and we'll cope. But yeah, if we're looking at, 40, 50% of our running back room having the same bye week, it's going to make life very difficult for us because, of course, if you go in this running back heavy early on, your hope is that the third running back is in your flex spot more often than not, because here on DraftKings, you're starting 2 running backs and then you've got the flex spot. We still are going to need to fill 3 wide receiver spots. But if that flex is going to a wide receiver over one of these early running backs, then there's a good chance that our team is dead already.
Yeah, so that's something that I would agree with. You will likely be looking to fill the flex too, based on the draft capital, but it's not essential. But usually, you want the players that you're drafting earlier to add up and move in. But without doubt, every single year there'll be a player that you draft in the first 4 rounds that is probably a failed season, an injury, whatever happens, and you will have a pick, in the 8th or 9th round that will replicate that value. But ideally, trying to avoid doing that on purpose would be the way to do it. It will be interesting to see. Ideally, now there's the balance. We want to see if we're going to take another running back here. I wouldn't be opposed to, as I said, having 3 through 6 rounds, for example, rather than having to go 1, 2, 3. I'm sure people aren't surprised to hear me say that, if we could get a wide receiver now, I'd be happy. But there's the balance between you want, quarterbacks, maybe some tight ends, and some wide receivers to go off the board. The trouble with that is then it also continues the wide receiver avalanche that it would have obviously kicked off at this particular point. The team that is drafting at the 1 spot now has started wide receiver with Lamb and Diggs. We have the team in 3, the team in 4, the team in 9, and the team in 10, and the team in 12 are all wide receiver starts. So it is quite heavy. Sam Laporta goes to a team that has started running back in the 102 spot, and that there, obviously, we did talk a little bit before we started about an elite tight end helping this sort of a particular build, but pretty much all builds. So you're trying to get that balance of, does the running back get back to you, or do you just get wiped out completely at wide receiver? So I'm interested to see how this plays out now. ETN would be in play. Pacheco goes off the board. So far, we have Kyron Williams off the board, Achan off the board. Not interested, as I mentioned, in Mixon and Jacob. So ideally, I would like to see both of those guys potentially go off the board here. And that would lead us to looking into that wide receiver position, I think, and then, a little bit later. But who knows? We might have a tight end that we fall back on. You just never know in these situations.
Yeah, and this feels like a much more running back heavy room than is typical. Like a lot of my drafts, you see in Pacheco fall at the back end of round 3, Achan going into the early stages of round 3, Kyron Williams sometimes fall into the back of round 3. So it's not necessarily going to be comfortable, but I think having that flexibility to say, okay, well, we're still building robust, but we're going to stretch it an extra round beyond the normal definitions because this year is such a wide receiver heavy market. So we're still getting the quality of running back that we might have usually. So yeah, it's It's unfolding interestingly. I wonder if Seabury07, who's at 102, is watching along and maybe decided to see if he could build a better version of his team than we do.
Maybe that's possible. I was thinking if we got Devontae or Deebo Samuel back, this would have been incredible there, but he didn't. But there is also the guy that we did talk about a little bit earlier, and he may be here. So what are you thinking? A couple of picks away, do we want to look at some of the names here at wide receiver, or is there a running back that you want to go in for? If some of these names hold as they are, I'm good either way.
So I mean, we could take Derrick Henry or push him around the corner. Travis Kelce's also fallen 8 spots past ADP, so I don't mind doing that, and then maybe seeing if Henry or Etienne comes back to us.
Yeah, I'm good on seeing which of the running backs come back. I think just by ADP and the value, we should go here with Kelce.
Yeah,
Not
it makes sense.
Again, it can be just a complete team that we're not normally drafting. We can draft I haven't drafted a lot of Kelce this year either.
Yeah, and we're probably not looking to stack him with Patrick Mahomes because that'll put us in a real situation where it becomes very difficult for us at wide receiver. But should we take Travis Etienne here, or do you want to push?
I'm good to go Etienne, but if you wanted to go with Flowers, for example, that's okay as well.
Let's get my first Etienne share of the drafting season. So through four,
we didn't false advertise anything here, Tom. We've 3 running backs through 4 rounds.
That's, men of our word. We've got Jahmyr Gibbs on a week 5 by Jonathan Taylor on week 14, Travis Kelce, and then Travis Etienne.
One of the reasons that I was okay to see with the Henry pick is Henry also had a week 14 bye that would have matched Jonathan Taylor. Yeah. So but again, he was past ADP there, which would have made it very interesting. But I think we made the right choice around the swing. In a vacuum, I do think that Etienne offers a lot more PPR upside than Henry, but you mentioned the 100-point games, for example. I also think that edges it to Henry. So they're very even for me there. But when we're looking at players who could profile like, let's say a cheaper version of a Jahmyr Gibbs, we took Jonathan Taylor earlier. If you say at the end of the season that Etienne, comfortably outscores or scores the same amount of total points as Taylor, I won't be surprised, based on how I think those offenses are going to work around. So we start off Gibbs, Taylor, Etienne, Kelce. And I do think, as we mentioned, it's good to maybe not just always draft Trey McBride in every single roster. But who knows? Maybe somebody comes back to us that makes it interesting. So we have 3 running backs through 4. I think this is the point now, obviously, to talk strategy of the full draft as we move forward here. So we have a couple of questions. One of them here, again, Deft Angel messaging in, are 2, 4, 12, 2 builds a thing. He mentions that he's done a few drafts where he's taken 11 wide receivers. So with the 3 names we have in mind, I think that if we had went Henry and Etienne, you could think that you were done at running back. But I feel like when it's 4 straight, I think it does really limit the upside of the overall roster. I think you're kind of sabotaging it a bit. Where I think that you could get into that, as we've talked about, the players that we like, let's say from Stevenson, Kenneth Walker, for example, maybe a James Conner, a player that we think is locked into really substantial work throughout the season and has upside along with it if things work out. Now, Stevenson, the concern is really huge with the offense there. But if you do that, you could say that you were set at 4 with all separate bye weeks. I think ideally you're looking to get into 5 and add somebody, in those double-digit rounds as well. What are you thinking in terms of overall builds? And I think as well, you can get into, it's balancing that roster out. Now that we have Kelce, you could go with 2 tight ends. You might want to get into 3 still, depending who that second tight end is. And then it all comes down to like, what happens at quarterback? Do you push quarterback out? So we have Stroud, Mahomes, Jackson, Allen, Hurts, all off the board. And one thing we didn't touch on in this draft was interesting. The drafter from the 1 spot took CeeDee Lamb, then Stephon Diggs. But they did take CJ Stroud as their first quarterback off the board the entire draft of the 301. That was obviously interesting based on the rankings as well. And no quarterback then went to the 4-1. But as he probably thought with this draft, none of those other 4 quarterbacks would have got back to him. So it's that balancing act. But I think it might just be that little bit too early. Since our last pick, though, Trey McBride, Pitts, and Kincaid have gone off the board. So having that Kelce pick makes you a little bit more comfortable at the tight end position. How are you thinking about that total number at the end when we've hit 3 at this point? Because this is an element that we don't generally discuss a huge amount. I guess we talk about it in as a theory, but in practicality, we don't work through it all that often.
So just looking back at the data from last year's DraftKings Milly Maker final, which again was well over 1,000 people, there were 2 teams in it with a 2-4-12-2. There was a 4-4-8-4. There was a 3-4-10-3. There were 7 of them. A 2-5-11-2. A 7 of them. 3-5-10-2. 2-5-10-3. I mean, I think that we've still got a lot of open paths at this point, and I think we can still kind of we can leave running back for a while. We could pick one up around that sort of round 11 to 15 range. And then if we find somebody right at the end of the drafts, like Will Shipley, who we tend to draft quite a bit, then that's fine. Particularly if that gives
week
us
5 bye week, so it could come in to be a problem. Week 5 bye.
Yeah.
That's where we passed on Barkley in the second round, really, was to get Shipley in the later rounds. The interesting thing here is it has been, non-wide receiver heavy quite a bit through this point, but there's still quite a few names that we're not all that intrigued by. But I have to say Keenan Allen this year, I feel like would be a player we have to pick here. Have you a different name that you want to pitch for before?
No, I'm completely fine taking Keenan Allen. I mean, Hollywood Brown has slipped 7 spots past ADP, but we're kind of seeing in general that be a thing at the minute where Rashee Rice is starting to increase back up the draft boards, and I think Hollywood's just falling because of that. If he made it around to us, I don't mind that 10 spots past ADP. I like him slightly more than Calvin Ridley, who's next up, but Calvin Ridley will give us some week 16 and 17 correlation. Chris Godwin after him, and then Rashee Rice. Hollywood does go, so we're back on the clock in terms of wide
I was going to say it depends if we want to try and do it. There is more running backs here at this point that I'm interested in, but you could look at George Kittle as well as a second tight end, but I don't think that fits in. Hit the wide receivers and show us who's available. Yeah, there's nobody there standing out to me immediately. Is there anybody that you want to pitch for?
I go for Chris Godwin. He's a guy I quite like. I think he'd also give us an out to Baker Mayfield, which works. So I'll draft him. Just in terms of looking where those quarterbacks are that we can still stack. We've got Keenan Allen, so Caleb is probably going to go in the next 3 rounds or so, and then Baker Mayfield kind of round 11. But by that point, we'll know what we're doing with our wide receivers, and we can figure out what we want, because we still do have to prioritize those things like stacking. And that's why, like, when we took Travis Kelce, you go, okay, well, we can't take Patrick Mahomes because firstly, he goes in round 4. But if we do that, that's a non-wide receiver pick. So some of the wide receivers we do pick, it's going to be making that argument of going, okay, how talented are they versus what kind of stack can I get if I choose somebody else who I view quite similarly?
I think that the looking at how the draft board played out over those last couple of picks, my question already would be, and we don't know this when the draft board's playing out, when you're making your pick, but Travis Etienne obviously was our selection at the 402. We took him over players like Pittman, but players then I'm not really targeting a lot of Pittman this year, but you have like Flowers, who I'm targeting, T. Higgins, even a Tank Dell potentially. On the way back then, we missed out on Jaden Reed. If we're looking at a 1v1 necessarily, we could have had Kenneth Walker or Aaron Jones instead of Godwin. You would have so you've Godwin and Etienne, but you could have had, say, Zay Flowers and Kenneth Walker. I think I would probably prefer the straight up Flowers versus Walker. Would that be the case for you? And it's not that I'm completely out in Godwin, but it hasn't been. He obviously had the huge year with was that with Winston, I believe the first big year was.
Yeah, and
trying to blend all these Tampa Bay quarterbacks together, but it hasn't hit that height. So obviously, had the serious knee injury as well in between.
Yeah, but the positive thing coming out of Tampa is that they're talking about moving him back into the slot. Like last year, he was down at like 35% slot rate. When he was really useful, he was playing there at like 60% rate. So I think giving him back those slot snaps, which we know are going to be layups and we know are going to be a bit of a cheat code in PPR formats, I think that there's definitely bounce back potential for Godwin this year. So yeah, I'm possibly finding him an easier click than Mike Evans, who's going in the 3rd round, kind of fringe of round 2 at times. But yeah, I'm not getting too carried away with the Bucs. I think there's still potential for them to take a backward step after Dave Canales left and went to the Panthers.
This here draft board for me seems to be
It's wild.
Yeah, it might just be that we have, gone with a different
we've
approach.
ruined it.
Yeah, it could be. But for us, obviously, it's a very different structure of a roster. But throughout the draft board, it's been quite interesting to see how many players are going off at certain spots. So we are down to Evan Ingram. He went back to back with David Njoku, but we have Kittle, Andrews, Kincaid, Pitts, McBride, Laporta, and Kelsey, obviously all off the board. It's been quite heavy at quarterback as well. When we look at the names, we're down through Jordan Love, Kyler Murray range. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes back. It feels like some of the ADP and players that you might usually see in these points are completely gone. I was kind of hoping, I don't know if you clicked the button or if he went. I was hoping that we might have seen, he's still there. I'm not going to mention it until it gets to us on the clock. But there is some names here I think that we can filter in at the wide receiver position. The only thing then what I'd be looking at is, tight end. I know I talk about it quite a bit. Bowers would probably come into conversation here. But maybe with having the running backs early, maybe we have to do something a little bit different at tight end today. What are you thinking at those positions?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd be quite happy taking 3 more wide receivers in a row and really getting back on track.
I think Deontay Johnson would be my first pick. Who would you go with as your?
No, I'm completely down with Deontay Johnson. Gives us that week 17 correlation against Chris Godwin. Gives us the opportunity for a late stack as well. I'm completely fine with that one, and then see which of these guys comes back around the corner.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well.
But basically, I mean, out of Christian Watson, Jordan Addison, Brian Thomas, and even Jameson Williams, I don't mind any of these options, even as far as Jackson Smith and Jigba. So where are we going, Colm?
Oh, we are back up. I was thinking Addison might come true. I'm good with going with Watson if you think his hamstrings are fixed.
I don't know if you can.
Again, I would be much more heavily drafting overall like a JSN. So I haven't drafted really much Watson at all, and that's from a Packers fan. I've been drafting Reed a lot more, Wicks a lot more. So let's take him.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if he was our third wide receiver, I know
that's why I was so
ADP.
That's why I wanted to get Johnson there so much, because I just think the PPR element for him is massive. Like and even though I shared, like, people may have realized there's some concerns there with Godwin based on how the last couple of years have gone for him, but him, Allen, and Johnson as your wide receiver 1, 2, and 3 feel quite good in this particular situation. That then, if you've gone without a wide receiver through 4, and your wide receiver 4 in round 8 then is Christian Watson with the upside that he potentially possesses, I think that's pretty substantial at wide receiver for what we have had to give up in those first 4 rounds.
Yeah, it's a very fragile wide receiver room. I would definitely say that. We're talking about 3 veterans who, Keenan.
I think I would be like so much. I would have a lot of optimism if as the pick I mentioned earlier, the Flowers. If it was Flowers and Walker, for example, I think I would be really in on this team so far. But I think we're managing it so far. It's going to be interesting to see where it ends up.
Yeah, definitely. I think that obviously, like, having that first wide receiver in round 4 as opposed to in round 5, because the way the turn is, that's an early round 4 pick rather than a late round 5 pick.
Yeah,
it definitely would feel slightly more comfortable. But this is the boomer exercise. This is how they built the teams back in the day, and we just have to get. For years, we've said people have to get comfortable being uncomfortable in 0 RB, and now, as Michael Scott would say, how the turntables.
Yeah, definitely. So, and the other one, like Jordan Addison, there went 1 pick before, and he was a player that I've drafted a lot of. But in this situation again, you want to also be aware and humble enough to realize, like, for all the optimism you could have for even JJ McCarthy coming in and Addison not having TJ Hawkinson at the start of the season and how things could play out, you have to also be aware that if you're like drafting him in every single draft and he sprains his ankle heavily and the last week of preseason and he misses time, like, you get into a very difficult situation. But there's a big difference if he's going to be your wide receiver 6, let's say, or he's going to be your wide receiver 4. So I get, and I'm saying that, and we drafted Christian Watson. That's more about exposures than the players, because Christian Watson has had a lot of trouble, obviously, with health, but he has shown some very big performances along the way as well. So as a wide receiver 4, I'm comfortable with that pick.
But I also think like Keenan Allen, Chris Godwin, Deontay Johnson have the potential to be high volume players. We
Oh,
know
very
that
much
Keenan
so.
Allen is. We know
Yeah.
Chris Godwin can be, and Deontay Johnson earns high amounts of targets. So the theory being like, if Christian Watson's going to get in our lineup, then hopefully he's just going nuclear that week, and we can kind of cope with him not doing
They're
so.
all players that should be outside of Watson. That is, that should be 8 to 10 targets minimum every single week. There should be somewhat floor, and I always, if this was a running back, I would be saying like be very cautious of talking about floor when you're in early July. But I do like the ones that we've got in there. So we are coming back up to our next pick here again. Any like anyone you want to stand on the table for here, or buying the table, or?
I quite like Tyler Lockett at this point. I'd be interested in Rashid Shaheed as well, who gives us later stacks. Same for Tyler Lockett. In terms of the rest of it, Jane Daniels fallen a little bit, but not enough where I'd be taking him
No.
now. So Lockett or Shaheed for me, Colm.
I would go Shaheed, I think. Unless you want to go, if you've, I see, no.
I'm fine. No, I've been trying to draft a little bit more Shaheed. I think for this build, again, much like Christian Watson, we're at a point where now we're looking for players who can go nuclear to get into our roster. So I'm fine with that. I mean, so now we've got
Yeah, let's
5
say
wide
you're right.
receivers.
I think you get your shot here. I think we take.
Tyler Lockett.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
this is kind of showing just when I'm normally drafting. These are a range of wide receivers that I'm not drafting. Like for example, like I would have been devastated if we were on a 0 RB roster and Raheem Mostert went one pick before. But
yeah,
this is where you're into 3 to 4 rounds of running backs. And
yeah,
so, and again, the thing with a Tyler Lockett is like as your wide receiver 6, that's fine.
yeah.
Again, not a player. A lot of these players actually, when we look through it, we're getting to quite a veteran team here overall in terms of the wide receivers. Not usually the way we're targeting them. The only one of these guys that's a really strong target for me this season would be Keenan Allen, and the next one in line out of these would be Deontay Johnson, who I'm putting in there as well. But he's like a target if it's after ADP. But it feels like in a roster like this, he needs to become an essential target to balance this build out. But when you have these players as your wide receiver 6, for example, that's fine. But I would ideally be having my 6th wide receiver by the time I'm, at Christian Watson at the latest, probably. And that's meaning then that you're trying to get those running backs in here. Brian Robinson, Devin Singletary have gone since Zach Moss went after the Shaheed pick before it got back as Lockett. They're all players that you'd be very interested in normally at this particular point. So through these opening 10 rounds, I think the roster that we've built I think we call it sustainable. I don't know what word we'll use, but I do think that we can also now with that, and maybe that's something potentially at that last pick, but I do think adding in the additional wide receiver is probably going to be beneficial at the end of the draft. But at that point, we had 5 wide receivers. We could have possibly went back to Robinson or Singletary. That'll be interesting to review. When we get to the end, had you with the 2 picks there, Shaheed and Lockett, do you think there's any of those you would have potentially changed out for a running back? I wasn't tempted really by the quarterbacks, and the reason for that was we didn't have any stacks at all
yeah.
through that particular point. Like Tua was available, Goff was available. If you did have some of their parts of the offense, you definitely would have been interested in those 2 guys over to Tyler Lockett, for example.
No, I feel quite comfortable. I mean, yeah, you can say Jared Goff stacks with Jahmyr Gibbs and maybe like take a dart throw that
Oh
way
yeah,
and
that's
then
true
look.
too.
But it's for
That was a long
me,
time. It was a long time since we draft Gibbs. I'd completely forgot about him.
yeah, it's kind of taking a first round running back. That doesn't sound right.
No.
Yeah. So, but I think what we did with Shaheed and Lockett is give ourselves different avenues to how we build the rest of this. Like, I feel quite comfortable with things. Yeah, it's a veteran wide receiver room, as we already talked about. But I'm not sure having Brian Robinson or Devin Singletary would have made me feel any better about this roster right now. Whereas, like now, I don't feel like we're forced into any decisions anytime soon.
Mhm.
We're a few picks away. We've got 3 running backs, 6 wide receivers, and a tight end. So, yes, we are going to have to figure out quarterback. This room has been fairly quarterback hungry with Justin Herbert already gone, Trevor Lawrence going just in the round 11. We're a couple of picks away, and the board feels kind of fine to me. So in terms of quarterback, we've got a while before we need to address that. Running back, Blake Corum, Jerome Ford, Zeke Elliott, Chase Brown, Gus Edwards. Wide receiver, we could go with one more, give ourselves more paths to outs. What are you thinking, Colm?
Yeah, Wicks would probably be the wide receiver I'd go for here, but see tight end. Just pull up tight end for a second. Any interest in like the likes of a Cole Kmet to add to this roster? Obviously, we
I'm
have
not
Keenan Allen.
I'm not a big Cole Kmet fan, but I think that he works as a tight end too. And then we can possibly just leave this at a 2 tight end build. So I'm fine with that. It gives us week 16 and 17 correlation against the Lions and the Seahawks. And then Wicks makes it back around. Do we want to take him, or do you want to take another old wide receiver and either Mike Williams or Adam Thielen?
No, I definitely don't want Adam Thielen. I think we'll go. No, well, we do. The only thing I would say on Wicks is we do have Christian Watson. If you want to go with Williams based on that, but
Well, let's go with Mike Williams, and then I'd feel really
God.
confident we have really good stacking options from here, because now you're looking and you're going, okay, we could take Baker Mayfield when things come back around. Aaron Rodgers comes back around at the same point. Geno Smith, Derek Carr, Bryce Young. I don't feel like we're going to get shut out of quarterback. And
This is.
normally,
I think that I'm going to add this up when we finish the show. This has to be the oldest average age of wide receivers I've ever drafted. It has to be. We also have Travis Kelce on the roster. This is an old team.
yeah, but look at the room. Like in terms of the other wide receivers that have gone off, Rob drafting out of the 108, who drafts in a lot of these with us, he's at 7 wide receivers already. But everyone else is sat at 5, 4, or 6 wide receivers. So yes, we don't have any rookies, which we normally kind of prioritize, but I just feel very confident that we've given ourselves enough outs that the core of this team has to be these first 4 picks: Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Travis Kelce, and Travis Etienne. So being able to add complementary stacks around them and get reasonable performances from our wide receivers who are going to ping pong in and out of our lineup, it feels okay to me.
It's good that one of us feels okay. No,
This was your idea.
It's definitely not. It's not what we'd normally be doing. But I have to say, it would look like those names on paper can produce. But I'd be very, very. If somebody else was drafting this roster, I'd be talking about the players who could be moving up the draft board next season. I don't think these names are jumping up many rounds heading into 2025, but they could also give you floor play to balance with those wide receivers and the tight end, as you mentioned. I like it in Komet there. The other player that I would have mentioned is possibly getting there would have been Luke Musgrave. I had potentially considered taking both of those guys, but I think structurally at this point it probably makes sense to take Williams. The other wide receivers, just for reference to go off after, were Wicks, Deontay Johnson, Pearsall, Gabe Davis, Adam Thielen, Wendell Robinson. And we'll see what starts to come back around to us. But it does open us up to, like, we have multiple late round quarterback options here. I think we're into a 3 quarterback build with this particular team, most likely. And in a vacuum, I would rather have Wicks than Mike Williams. But we're also hoping that, we have Christian Watson being the wide receiver of the Packers that is, able to produce this season. So we're kind of making certain bets that we're not normally making. But yeah. It's going to be interesting
Yeah.
to see how we manage these last 6, 7 rounds.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we could be looking at like a 3-5, 3-5, 3-6-8-3, possibly, if we wanted to. I mean, we could definitely stop at 2 tight ends. I think the 3 quarterbacks is going to be a must given what we're kind of looking at.
I enjoy Ryan or Adam's comment here that he says you rarely hear a best ball roster described as sustainable. Yeah, I couldn't think of, and I still think that's probably the most appropriate phrase that we have. Baker Mayfield does go. He was obviously somebody that we could have factored in, but Aaron Rodgers is somebody who would be available here quite a bit past ADP. Geno Smith would be available here. We could potentially, go back to back here with quarterback. Is that something that you want to do? Just star. What have you a preference of those 2 guys?
I'd possibly take Geno Smith first. Garrett Wilson's at the 110, so
Yeah, he's
I
off
feel like
on it.
you're not taking Garrett. You're probably not taking Rodgers unless you've got Garrett Wilson, but I prefer Geno Smith.
Okay. How do you feel about taking both of them? Have you another name here that you kind of have to have?
No, when you look at the wide receivers, you could add Leggett to give you a bit more for a Bryce Young stack. There's nobody at tight end who screams out to me. Running back, it's all kind of the same tier that I think we can look at when we come back. And quarterback, we're looking further down the board, so I'm good with
Okay,
Aaron
do you want
Rodgers.
to try and do you want to take that's another? We'll get a young player. No, do you want to take Leggett? Was what I was going to say. What do you want to do?
Let's take Leggett. Let's take Leggett, and then I think that we've got to be done at wide receiver. But we are, yeah, and then we're looking at probably now. I doubt Aaron Rodgers comes all the way back, but we've given ourselves that extra sort of selection, and now we're probably hoping that we get Derek Carr and Bryce Young to round out the quarterback room, or find another one of these guys with something, whether that's Will Levis with one of the
Justin
late.
Fields hasn't been drafted yet. But so we do see Rodgers get drafted, but when we look then through the rest of them, I do think that's what we're looking at. This is where you get into those kind of tricky situations with managing a roster here and drafting from back to front to see what's available for you on these particular picks. For example, normally some of the players that you would be looking to get here who were available, the Broncos wide receivers were options who then you would kind of pair in with a Bo Nix, for example. That is where it gets challenging, I think, at this particular point, is these wide receivers that are available, and then the tight ends that are available are definitely more challenging to assemble a roster with confidence than the ones obviously going earlier and then filtered in with those late quarterbacks to stack with those guys. But I do think getting Leggett, getting a young player in there who I'm not all that confident in, but I think having him along with Johnson, if we do, we don't get Bryce Young either, so that doesn't work out for us.
Yeah, I immediately regret the way we've played this. We should have taken Rodgers.
But we'll work it out. We'll work it out. I would say that, the opening part of the draft, kind of you would be comfortable with how it's going. The players that we're having to pick here are all players who are generally not targets, which I think reinforces the players that are at the front of the board and the way we generally play it being the way to play it. But we will round it out here, and this team will go on to win the $1.5 million. Don't worry about that, Tom.
No worries whatsoever. There's a couple of ideas that I've got that if we find ourselves in a sticky situation, we can possibly leverage to get back on track. But yeah, looking back now, Aaron Rodgers over Leggett was probably a better call. But I mean, it's always tricky to know when these quarterback runs are going to come, because Aaron Rodgers had fallen over a round past ADP, and sometimes that just has a knock-on effect, and you see yourself getting value.
I was pretty certain, having drafted, but that the drafter that did take Young was the Adam Thielen drafter. But I was pretty sure that we would be having the option there of getting back Young in that particular situation. So that sets us up here now, potentially with a Derek Carr. Any other players standing out for you that you would like to get? We do have Daniel Jones is still available. Obviously, would be another player. Bo Nix is somebody who I mentioned a lot. But yeah, Derek Carr. And one of the reasons that I was okay to pass on Aaron Rodgers was Derek Carr, Bryce Young, and Aaron Rodgers all had the Week 12 bye, I believe. So that would have meant that getting the third one of them was a little bit trickier. Wouldn't be against here either, Derek Carr and then Daniel Jones, but I think we go Carr here.
Yeah, taking Derek Carr made too much sense. I'm just looking around to see what else we could set up if we wanted to. We could take somebody from the Patriots, like Hunter Henry goes, say that. In terms of running back room, we could, I was trying to see if there was something we could do there, because we still are going to need a couple more running backs. But I'm happy to take Daniel Jones if you are. He's started to rise up in price a little bit.
Yeah, that's the way I would go here. I think we need to get the third quarterback.
Yeah, and in terms of quarterbacks who I'm happy to take without lots of stacking options already on the board, I don't mind Daniel Jones. I mean, Darius Slayton's still out there. And Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton, it was kind of underreported that after he held his little contract holdout. He did get a new improved contract this year. It wasn't big money, but he's back with the team and everything seems to be fine now. So I don't mind taking Darius Slayton. I don't mind taking Jalen Hyatt and banking on him having a improved role this year. And then, of course, you've got the late round tight ends, which you can take one of in the last round if we felt the need to. But so through 16 rounds, after taking 3 running backs in the first 4, we've now not taken a running back since then. We've got probably going to need to get to 5, I would imagine.
I think
Colm,
5, yeah. 5, and we can, like, you would review it with players available. I think the way we're set up now, it is kind of, we have our quarterbacks. We are probably okay at wide receiver, but it's just at this is the point where now we have flexibility for the rest of the draft. Usually you have the flexibility for the rest of the draft at round 12, whereas we have been forced into these decisions at this particular point of the draft. So that would be another part of, when you're striking this balance of how you want to draft. I have no problem with the 3 quarterbacks that we've actually drafted in this. That's not, but it's the combination of how we've had to do it, and then the players that you're passing up in those situations to try and build out the roster.
Yeah, and like I say, I've regretted letting Aaron Rodgers go, but if Derek Carr hadn't have made it back to us, then I would have felt pretty disgusted about what we'd let happen. But getting Derek Carr stacked with Shaheed, we've got Geno Smith stacked with Tyler Lockett, and then we've got Daniel Jones currently without any stacking partner, but as we covered, we can figure that out. But if we'd been looking at some kind of combination of having to then add another wide receiver or tight end to stack with Drake May, or then getting into, I know you feel better about Justin Fields than I do, but immediately then you're talking another quarterback who's unstacked. Like, if we'd had to add Justin Fields and Daniel Jones to get out of jail, it would have been
no, we pushed it here at the quarterback position a lot. I think that we also had to, I feel like, because really up until that point, it wasn't a point where I was thinking quarterback's the necessity here. I feel like the challenges of having those 3 early running backs is what it's a good experiment, I think, to do. And I'm looking forward to when we finish this and looking at the board to see where we could have changed it. But often when we do our other drafts, we'll feel like, yeah, there's maybe something you would change. I think in this one, we're going to have definitive things that we would definitely swap. So we are 3 picks away. There was a question that came in from Deft Angel and was asking, is Evan Ingram an elite tight end? He's asking for a friend. I think anyone that gets 100 targets at the tight end position is probably in that category. But I think while he did come in with a profile that could show him being elite, I think he's based on volume more than pure upside as a player at this particular point. But I think he has to be factored into it. We are back on the clock. I do think the running backs here are interesting. Both Chicago guys are interesting. But is this a team where you want to take a flyer on the likes of somebody coming back from an injury like Keaton Mitchell? ADP wise, so I think we have to go here with probably Herbert.
Yeah, I'd rather take Khalil Herbert as our 4th. And then if Keaton Mitchell comes back to us or drops, maybe we could do something with it. In terms of tight end, we could stack Noah Fant with Geno Smith, give ourselves our 3rd tight end.
We probably should have done it the other way around too.
Or we could take Juwan Johnson to stack with Derek Carr, although he does fall sometimes. Or take Theo Johnson to stack with Daniel Jones.
This is bleak. This is a bleak timeline. I think let's go with the tight end, because there is still running backs that I want to get. You can pick the tight end.
Let's go Theo Johnson. I've not drafted much of him. It's a bit of an upside shot, but when we've got a room with Cole Kmet and Travis Kelce, I think we can afford to take the rookie tight end and hope that he kind of outplays his ADP and outplays what the expectations are for him. It's possibly not the kind of selection that I'd be looking to do more often than not, but I just think having at least one stacking partner with each quarterback is something that I want to leave every draft with.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I was very confident Fant would have come around those 2 picks at the turn. He did not, obviously, but Fant would have fit in quite well with the Geno pick. But Theo Johnson, as you mentioned, again, just not huge belief that it's definitely going to be an impact in year one for him. Makes that a little bit of a challenge as well. And I think, when you look at this, again, I know we took Kelsey, but you know how I'm continuing to push, 2 tight ends at that early portion. You can really see when you get into this area where it's challenging. Like in a vacuum, I would rather draft Jelani Woods over Theo Johnson, but then it just didn't fit the build. And I don't really have much interest even with the Derek Carr team and Juwan Johnson.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've drafted a Colts tight end at any point this offseason. I'm kind of fine with that because every year people have their favorite one who could be, it's Kylan Grunson, it's Jelani Woods, it's Mo Alley Cox. Somebody mentioned Mo Alley Cox to me as a sleeper the other day, and I had to point out to them that he's just turned 30 years old. Like,
he might actually be sleeping. The thing with Woods, he had a pretty solid rookie year and then missed the whole of last season with an injury, and has a good athletic profile. So I still think there's potential there for him, but he feels like a project rather than, and I guess that's why he's been drafted in the 16th round.
Like if the Colts had gone out and drafted Brock Bowers or something, then it'd be easy to start going, okay, you can make parallels back to when Shane Steichen was with the Eagles and used Dallas Goedert in the screen game lots, and it could be a really good result for PPR leagues. But since it got to Indy, there's not really been any point where I'm like, I believe that he wants a tight end to be a big part of this offense. So maybe I'm just a bit skeptical on it.
More skeptical than I am about this roster, or
see, like I'm okay with this roster. I think that there's still plenty of good to it. Like, yeah, it's a bit dusty in places, but with a 3-4-8-3 and the upside I think it has, I'm okay. So like, obviously we're done at quarterback, we're done at tight end, we've got 2 picks left. We could get up to a 3-6-8-3, which has been a structurally sound build on this platform for a long time. Or we could move up to 9 wide receivers and take one of these Giants wide receivers who's still left, Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt. Running back, there is your guy, Colm. There's Clyde Edwards-Helaire there. Things get pretty miserable after that. Alexander Mattison would give us week 16 and 17 correlation as well. What'll get you back on track with this team, Colm?
A miracle. But we are, the one thing I was going to ask you is, I can't see the full roster. Have we got multiple week 5 buys at running back at this point?
Week 5, 14, 12, and then 7. Okay. So yeah, we're okay.
Yeah, I would take Shipley here as the first pick at running back. I think another running back's probably the way to go. And I seen that Slayton went, but I would be open to taking the remaining Giants wide receiver, let's call it that, and Darius Slayton, who you mentioned has after getting himself a nice big contract.
Well, there's Will Shipley on the team, so I know you'll be.
The team's saved. Right? It's fixed.
But yeah, I mean, Darius Slayton will come back around to us. Otherwise, there's nobody really in this range that I'm desperate to draft. How about you? You fine with Slayton?
I think that makes sense with this team.
So, through 20 rounds, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Travis Kelce, Travis Etienne, Keenan Allen, Chris Godwin, Deontay Johnson, Christian Watson, Rashid Shaheed, Tyler Lockett, Cole Kmet, Mike Williams, Geno Smith, Xavier Legette, Derek Carr, Daniel Jones, Khalil Herbert, Theo Johnson, Will Shipley, Darius Slayton. It's fun.
The one thing I want to mention there is Rob. I've never seen this happen on the stream before. Because I defended Jelani Woods, who I assumed that he drafted, he left Will Shipley for us. It's usually the opposite way around. That may not be a good sign for my belief in Will Shipley. The people are just leaving him to come back to us at this particular point. But we do get him in. We get Herbert along with those first 3 running backs. So running backs very strong, I think, and obviously we want to have those guys maximizing the opportunities. I think we're okay at tight end. Theo Johnson's in there more so just for stacking purposes, but if he does hit, that obviously works for us. We get another piece in and Slayton. In terms of looking at the wide receivers, it is a very packed wide receiver room there, and I'm drafting multiple other pass catchers in that offense ahead of the ones that we have drafted today. So that's not a good sign, but we'll see how that plays out. The quarterbacks, I think, is enough of a kind of a late round Frankenstein to work out. We get, still the Russian potential for Daniel Jones. We get Derek Carr stacked. We get Geno Smith stacked. Maybe having, going back to the conversation, we've taken Lockett there. I'm interested to see what we could do to flip some things around. I think we have enough depth at wide receiver based on having gone with the running backs early, but there's still, for me, quite a few concerns in there. And the players and the 1v1s that go in those similar positions, particularly to Shaheed and Lockett, for example, even Christian Watson, and then you're into Cole Kmet. There's some other players that I would probably like to take in that. So not as much with that Kmet pick, I guess, as the other ones, but the 3 picks before that, there's other ways that I would probably like to go with those if we had started off the opening rounds differently. When we looked though at the players that we didn't take, the one that we immediately regretted that you mentioned was the Leggett pick. And obviously that becomes more of a concern when we then miss out also on Bryce Young, who, again, I was very confident will be coming back to us in the 15th round. But between when we passed on Rodgers went, Levis went, Young went, McCarthy went, Deshaun Watson went, and then Derek Carr, then we took Daniel Jones. So there's a lot of quarterbacks in that area. How do you feel about that now with how it's played out after the fact? If it was a case that we took Rodgers there, we wouldn't have taken one of either Carr or Daniel Jones. That would have meant that with the Daniel Jones pick, potentially, for example, we could have went with Bucky Irving as another running back option. Ray Davis is there. What would you be thinking of flipping it around? Some of the wide receivers that we've kind of passed up on that range, Troy Franklin would have went before Derek Carr, but Marvin Mims went after Daniel Jones. So there's quite a few different names that would have been, I think, interesting there.
Yeah, I don't feel as bad about that as I did. I think Aaron Rodgers is definitely comparable.
I think they're just in a group of, they're in a tier of quarterbacks at that point.
The one that stands out to me is if I could have it back, I wouldn't have taken Theo Johnson over Juwan Johnson. I would have taken Juwan Johnson there as our third tight end to start with Derek Carr, and then push to get either Jalen Hyatt or Darius Slayton as our last wide receiver. So the Daniel Jones stack was smaller and the Derek Carr stack was bigger. I think that's probably how I would have preferred to play that one. The counter argument would be that the Giants offense isn't going to be as fun. So having 2 shots at the cherry with one of those players possibly making it into a good game scenario with Jones maybe makes some sense. But yeah, I think overall I've got more faith in Juwan Johnson, and that was possibly the wrong call there.
Yeah, the other potential thing I think we could have done was taken Fant instead of Herbert and seen if Herbert or Johnson, one of them, that's Rashawn Johnson, would have got back around. Herbert was past ADP. Johnson was, a little bit before ADP at those particular picks. And the drafter out of the 12 didn't take a running back through those last 4 rounds. So we could have potentially went Fant at the Herbert pick and still got Herbert potentially in hindsight. But those are the things that you can't really tell at the time, because that was also a team who, had gone tight end through the 2 of the last 3 picks, but they hadn't gone a tight end before that. So they end up with 4 tight ends in the last 6 picks on that particular roster. So again, the flow of the draft, I would say as well, again, I'm not drafting that this way as much. There was a lot more focus for me on like who's available, what's going to be available, how are we doing with the structure, rather than like the normal flow of like, this is what we do here, that's what we do there, these are the options there, and that there kind of all clicks together. And if we were doing that, we probably would have been looking at the team in 12 and been like, well, maybe they do need more at the tight end position. The other part too that I have said a lot is drafting between spot 4 and spot 8. It gives you a lot more flexibility than drafting at either of the turns. And again, that is another challenge that this draft provided. So while it works out in round 1, round 2, and then even getting Kelsey in round 3, I do think it provides quite a few challenges on balancing out what you're doing throughout the entire draft and looking at the bigger picture, because you also don't have, maybe if you're not doing a stream, but when you're doing a stream, you're also like trying to talk through the selections and the players. And when it comes back to you, sometimes it's not you're not as fully developed in your thought of the next pick as maybe you could be in this situation. So we look at the team. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. What are you giving it, Tom?
I'm gonna give it a 6.5 out of 10 because I think that there's flaws. I'd ding the tight end room slightly for that selection I mentioned. I think the wide receiver room gets knocked down by a couple of spots because it is pretty dusty and it's going to be tricky at times. But the rest of the way, the running back room, it's fun. It's not something I would do very often, but to have a roster and to be able to come back to this week in and week out and check in on how Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, and Travis Etienne have performed, I feel like there's going to be plenty of weeks where that does deliver and it is quite fun. So,
and I think maybe that's part of the mindset of that. When I draft this roster, I probably need to let the dust settle and look at it in 3 days' time. And because when I look at it, I'm kind of like, well, the first player we drafted was Keenan Allen. Maybe that's an oversight on my behalf. But I think it's been a fun. All these are fun to work through, fun process. And then Adam has messaged in question: what happens when zero RB guys are forced to use the robust RB strategy? You see me sweating throughout the entire draft. I think that was the title of the stream, is the title of the podcast, but we can see the chat. He puts in the answer: they are filled with regret. So we will see if we do this more throughout the course of the rest of the offseason. But I think, like you're saying, in hindsight, when we look at this throughout the season, it might perform better. I think the key was that we waited after that round 4 to load up then on the wide receiver position. But Tom, as we get ready to close this out, anything you've got going on, we'll be back over hopefully next week on the Fantasy Sanctuary channel to stream. I'll just call it, maybe not as heavy RB early on. What else have you got going on in between?
Yeah, so I've just launched a new podcast, which we'll be doing weekly with Andrew Erickson on the Fantasy Pros channel. We're talking risers and fallers every week. We're drafting as well, putting into practice what we think the most important advantages are as players start to rise and fall. There's going to be a lot of volatility over the next few weeks. On Sunday, we'll be drafting in the Fantasy Pros $350 championship on FFPC. That's 4 p.m. Eastern if you want to come and draft against us, and then we'll be reviewing that draft. I've got Chris Allen from Fantasy Life will be joining me for a DraftKings draft on Wednesday. Then next week, I've got Dwayne McFarlane joining me. So plenty of drafting stuff going on. And of course, drafting with yourself next Tuesday, Colm, which will be no doubt lots of fun.
A loaded schedule for Tom. And we also have a Pros versus Joes over at the FFPC where me and Tom are teaming up. And that one, we might have some updates. That'll be a slow draft, but we'll talk about that at some point. But that's going to do it for this edition of the show. If you are signing up over at rotoviz.com to get access to the content and tools, you can use the code RBRadio2024 at checkout. Get yourself a 10% discount while signing up. Lots of content up on the RotoViz Radio YouTube channel and, of course, the podcast channel over the next couple of days. And, of course, pretty much the same every single week. I just posted a Stealing Bananas from Sean Siegel and Ben Gretsch today. There's a Best Ball Banana stand up there as well. And there'll be lots of RotoViz Overtime content coming your way. But until we are back, have a good one.